Hey there. So in the last lesson, which was lesson 6, we talked about copyright infringement, and this one, lesson 7, we talk about defenses to copyright infringement. So let me give you a bit of an introduction to this, because I have to warn you, it's going to be a little bit heavy going. Again, we're talking about copyright law, and some parts of copyright law are not that easy. So maybe if you haven't had a cup of coffee in the last sort of couple of hours, pause the video now, go and get a nice strong cup of joe and come back and listen to this one after you've had a coffee, because it's a little bit complicated. Sorry, can't be helped. Now, in that last lesson, we delved into the murky world of copyright infringement and discovered that essentially a copyright infringement occurs when the creator of a subsequent work uses without permission a substantial part of the original work, of an earlier work of another person, another songwriter, another creator. Now, we also mentioned that substantial part is not an easy term to define, and what is a substantial part will be different case by case. Again, sorry, there's no way getting around that. It is a qualitative analysis. That complicated things, and I'm sorry, but things are now going to get even a little bit more complicated. Once we've determined that there has been a copyright infringement, our next step is to say, well, maybe it's allowable. In certain circumstances, you are actually allowed to infringe copyright. It's not quite as cut and dried as some people would expect it to be. A lot of people think that it's strict liability. You infringe copyright, you pay. It doesn't work quite as simply as that. What happens is that you're allowed to infringe copyright in certain circumstances. Now, some of these circumstances are fairly complicated, and none of you probably want to do a college law degree, although hopefully maybe one or two of you are inspired by these classes and you think, maybe I'd actually like to be a music lawyer. Good luck to you. I hope you do want to do that. But, well, I hope you think about that. Maybe you don't really want to do that. But here's the thing. This is not a college law degree. And there are very complex issues to be examined. What makes it even more complex is that the law is not identical country to country. Generally speaking, the overall concept of copyright is, as we've discussed previously, understood and used in a fairly level playing field in most countries of the world. However, there is subtle differences with the way that the courts in different countries have interpreted it, and one of the key areas is this idea of copyright defenses. So, the basic principle is this: certain situations are allowable where copyright infringement is not going to result in you being held liable under the law. Now, some of them are really obvious, and we won't spend too much time on that. There is a general defense that if something is for the purpose of education, but it has to be a legitimate form of education. You can't say, hey, I'm going to rip off somebody else's song because I'm teaching myself how to write songs and I'm educating myself, and it just so happens that this song that I've written, I've released and had 10 million streams of this song, but it was purely done for the purposes of education. No, it has to be a legitimate education purpose. Another copyright defense is for the purpose of reporting the news, and we won't go into that very much here because it's not really a situation that occurs much in relation to songs or recordings. The other copyright defense, or rather copyright infringement defense, goes under the heading of parody and satire. This is based in the idea that if you were going to make some sort of social comment or some sort of analysis of other people's work, In order to make that sort of analysis, whether it's comedic or not, you need to be able to reproduce the work in some way. So the perfect example of parody and satire when it comes to music is, of course, Weird Al Yankovic. I'm hoping you're all familiar with Weird Al's work. If you're not, again, just Google Weird Al and you'll probably get quite a surprise what you find. But assuming you know who he is, Weird Al does parodies of successful songs. So the most famous one probably is a song that he called Eat It, which was a parody of Michael Jackson's Beat It. And if you are not familiar with that, it's probably worth 3 minutes of your time on YouTube. Now, Al actually, from what I understand, actually gets permission from the owner of these songs. And most people are very happy to give their permission. But even if he didn't seek permission, he would probably be able to do that on the basis that he is creating a parody or satire of the original work. In the case of Eat It, he's making a comment about American society's preoccupation or obsession with fast food. And that's, a subject that he chose to make some sort of satirical comment about. Now, whether you find it funny or not, it doesn't really matter. It's a parody or a satire, and it is a defence to copyright infringement. Another defence to copyright infringement is for legitimate criticism or review. So if you have a music website where you review albums, you could reproduce at least part of that music in order to make a legitimate criticism or review of it. But you can't reproduce an entire catalogue of an artist's work and then at the end of it say, I really love this artist, great music, because what you're actually doing is you're running an illegal streaming site and not a legitimate criticism or review site. So again, don't think that the law is so stupid as to allow obvious, blatant copyright infringement and say, we'll allow that because it's got a tiny element of criticism or review about it. If you're commercially benefiting from the use of somebody else's work, chances are the court will not allow you the defence of criticism or review. Now, that's disposed of a few of the more simple and obvious exceptions or defences to copyright infringement. This is where things start to diverge depending on which country you're watching this in. There is this overall concept that you are allowed to infringe somebody else's work if your use is fair. Now, in Australia, and I believe England as well, the concept, I could be wrong about that if you're in England, so don't quote me, but certainly in Australia, the concept is one of fair dealing. If you deal with the work in a fair way, you are allowed to infringe copyright. In America, the phrase is fair use, and for any of you that have had any exposure to this area, you're probably thinking, fair use is so complicated, it's really hard to determine what fair use is. Now, fair use or fair dealing is definitely a complicated subject. And again, this is not a college law degree, and I'm sure none of you want it to be. The concept, as I said, is quite different country to country as well. Now, the logic behind this, though, the philosophy, if you like, behind fair use is that, all right, there needs to be some safety valve in copyright law. If copyright law is so strict that you cannot use anyone else's work without their permission, it's going to stifle the use of work generally. It's going to stifle creativity. It's going to stifle fair comment. And the law says, well, no, we need some sort of safety valve or get out clause here. Now, the examples that I've already given you, education, reporting the news, parody and satire, The point of that is this idea that society wants learning or a free flow of information or free speech or commentary, and that should outweigh the strict rights of the copyright owner to prevent unauthorised use of their work. So there is like a social philosophical basis behind this fair use. In Australia, it's very restricted. Fair use has to fit into one of those categories. It has to be a parody or satire, or it has to be for education. It can't just be, well, it's not really one of those things, but overall it's fair. In the US, the courts have got a lot more flexibility in determining that a particular use is a fair use. Judges are able to look at a situation and say, all right, without identifying that it fits in a particular category of fair use, we still regard it as a fair use. And even IP lawyers sometimes struggle with that concept. Us lawyers, we like things to be defined. We like to be able to say, well, you know, this is what the law says, it's black and white, and you have infringed copyright or you have not. So this fair use concept, where we leave a fair bit of the discretion up to judges and courts, kind of disturbs some lawyers. They find it a little bit concerning. Now, in one respect, fair use is a really simple thing. Fair use is fair when it's fair. And you go, great, Andrew, what are you trying to tell us there? That's the most circular argument you've ever heard in your life. Fair use is fair when it's fair. Let me break this down. The court will actually consider certain relevant points to determine whether a use is a fair use. The first thing is how important copyright is, the copying is to your work. If you are reviewing a photograph, reviewing half a photograph isn't going to help you very much. In order to make some sort of valid comment on a photograph, you need to see the entirety of the photograph. It's the composition of the photograph, it's the light and shade, it's the framing, it's the everything about the photograph. You can't say, oh, I'm just going to use half of the photograph and write an informed review about it. Less original works may not be protected as strongly as more creative works. If a work is particularly creative and unique, it's more likely to be protected by copyright, and the court is likely to say, well, that's not a fair use because it's such a specific and unique work that's been created. If it's possible to get permission at a fair price, the court is likely to say, well, you should have just got permission. It's not that hard. If you'd asked the copyright owner, they would have happily allowed you to use that work, and you just chose not to. They'll say, well, that's not really fair. Here's one of the key points, is if your use of somebody else's work undermines the market for the original work, then your use is probably not fair. So if I was to put an entire Harry Potter movie on, a blog and people could watch the entire film, they'd say, well, that's not fair. You are undermining the original work. You are saying to people, hey, you don't need to, pay Netflix to watch Harry Potter. You don't need to buy a DVD of Harry Potter. You can just watch it on this guy's website. So I'm undermining the market for the original. And that's really where a court is likely to say that a use is not fair. The more you take, the less likely it is to be a fair use. So they're the sort of things that courts will throw around. Even with those guidelines, though, courts have still tried to determine, how they can summarise this concept of fair use. And the word that they've come up with is transformative. And this was a case in a US Supreme Court in 1994, And they said that the emphasis is on the purpose and character of your use as being an important indicator of fair use. What they've said is, if your use of somebody else's work is transformative, i.e. you've taken their work and you've turned it in to something different by, adding a degree of social commentary, by putting it in a context that changes the nature of the work, it is probably regarded as fair use, if it is a transformative use. If all you're doing is copying the original and representing the original work basically in an unchanged way to the public, your work is probably not transformative and it is probably not fair use. So the question the courts ask is, have you added to the original by creating new information, new aesthetics, new insights, new understandings? Have you given a different twist or a different flavour to the original work? Or is it simply just a copy? If it's just a copy and there is no transformative element, chances are the court will not say it's a fair use. Now, there has been numerous cases around this concept of transformative use. If you're really interested in this area, one obvious case, if you go back a little bit in time, is the famous Barack Obama Hope poster. If any of you saw that poster in the lead up to Barack Obama's being elected as the President of the US, there was this poster with an image of him and the word hope underneath it. That image of him was taken from a photograph, and they reproduced the photograph. But the idea was, by adding the word hope and colorizing it so it has the colors of the American flag, that it was a transformative use. They took the original, relatively bland photograph and turned it into a statement about American politics and American society and the future of America should Barack Obama be elected. And that, even though that case never made it to court, that would be a fairly obvious example of what would be a transformative use. All right, so you would love me to give you a nice summary of whether you are able to use somebody else's work and claim a defence of copyright, a copyright defence against infringement. This is the closest I can get to. Generally, a use will be fair if you are copying for a valid reason, if you don't copy more than you need, if you give attribution, give credit to the original work where possible, and if your work is not directly competing in the market against the original. So I'll let you just pause, read that paragraph, let it sink in. Valid reason, only copy the least amount that you need, give attribution where possible, and hope that your work is not competing in the market against the original. You're probably okay. So if you are sampling, if you are referring to someone else's melody or lyric, if you are creating promotional artwork, a video, a meme, you ask yourself, is this a transformative use? Is your work likely to compete in the market against the original? And if the answer is no, you're not undermining the value of the original work, you're probably okay. Quick disclaimer, this is not legal advice. This is education and information. And if you are thinking about a sampling situation or using somebody's funny photograph to create a meme, probably you'd want to get some legal advice before you go ahead and do that. This is just for information only. Disclaimer given. All right, now, it's all very well to say, hey, now you're experts at copyright law, and to an extent you are, and that's great. Hopefully you won't need this knowledge. Hopefully you won't find yourself in any type of copyright dispute either now or in the future. You won't be a copyright infringer, or you won't have your copyright infringed. I sincerely hope that you can stay out of the courts and stay out of copyright disputes. And most of you will. But it is important that you understand this stuff. The best way to stay out of the courts and away from us lawyers is to prevent rather than cure. So hopefully your knowledge of copyright now is a long way ahead of most of your peers, and hopefully that will serve you very well in your careers going forward. Thanks for hanging in there on this one. It was a tough one, it was a long lesson, and it was a complex one, but I hope you recognise that it was an important one. Thanks for hanging in there.